According to disturbing reports, the gruesome twosome's marriage has dissolved into a toxic mess. Behind the polished veneer of their so-called warm and loving reunion with the king, there was a far frostier truth. While there was undoubted joy as Charles revelled in the company of his grandchildren Archie and Lilibet for the first time in 4 long years.
On paper, that's sweet. Grandpa finally gets to meet the grandkids he's only seen in photos. That's the kind of thing that should write itself as a nice, simple, feel-good story. Except, and this is the part nobody is spinning correctly, Camilla reportedly sat in on the conversations throughout the visit. Not because she was desperate to bond with her step-grandchildren over biscuits. According to reports, it was made very clear that nothing said in that house was going to end up in a newspaper afterward, and that if it did, everyone would know exactly who to blame, which, is a completely normal thing to have to manage at a family reunion. Don't worry, kids. Grandpa's new wife is just here to make sure nobody is wearing a wire. That's not a reunion. That's a hostage exchange with better lighting and slightly nicer scones. And look, it's not exactly a secret that Camilla isn't Harry's biggest fan. He didn't do himself any favors on that front either, considering he spent a chunk of his memoir describing her in less than flattering terms. So the idea that she'd suddenly be thrilled to have him and Meghan back in the house, unsupervised, chatting away to reporters in her head, that was never realistic. She wasn't there for the tea. She was there for damage control. Meanwhile, over in Wales, William and Kate reportedly weren't exactly popping champagne about this whole visit happening in the first place. And honestly, that tracks. If you've spent years publicly refusing to speak to your brother after interviews, after a memoir that didn't exactly paint you in a flattering light, watching Dad quietly roll out the welcome mat probably doesn't feel like closure. It feels like being told to smile through Thanksgiving dinner next to the cousin who wrote a tell-all book about the family and is now expecting everyone to just move on. So despite whatever brief thaw happened between Harry and his father, the rest of the family dynamic is still, by every account, ice cold. One nice afternoon at Highgrove doesn't undo years of very public fallout. It just means everyone agreed to be polite for a weekend. If you're new here, this is where we take the most exhausting celebrity royal drama and actually break down what happened, instead of just repeating the headline and moving on. So stick around, because there is a lot to get through today. Part 2. The lawsuit that ate £50 million. Now here's the part where things get genuinely rough for Harry, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think even the best PR team in the world could spin this one into a win. Before this whole family visit, Harry had a rather large problem waiting for him back in a London courtroom. He'd brought a case against the publisher of the Daily Mail, alleging phone hacking and unlawful information gathering. 97 separate allegations. That's not a lawsuit. That's a conspiracy thriller with a table of contents. The judge threw out every single one of them. Every single one. And he wasn't alone in this. Elton John and Liz Hurley were part of the same case. So now you've got a literal duke, a music legend, and a Bridget Jones alum all staring down a legal bill that's been estimated north of £50 million for a case that, in the end, produced exactly none of the wrongdoing it promised to expose. If you're keeping score at home, that's not speaking truth to power. That's setting £50 million on fire to make a point that the courts, quite bluntly, said wasn't true. And it wasn't just Harry and his co-claimants who paid a price here. Reportedly, around 40 journalists were dragged through roughly 4 years of litigation over accusations that were never actually proven. That's 4 years of these people's lives spent defending themselves against claims a judge ultimately dismissed entirely. And then, because subtlety has never really been the family brand, Harry reportedly went after the judge afterward, essentially accusing him of presiding over a whitewash, which is a genuinely bold move to make publicly, considering that same judge still has to rule on who ends up footing the bill for the entire case. You don't usually insult the guy holding the invoice before he's finished writing it. Add in the fact that maintaining a home like Montecito isn't cheap, and you start to see why some reports are describing this less as an inconvenience and more as a full-blown financial headache the Sussexes can't really afford right now. Part 3. The Diana Detour. While he was back in Britain, Harry also made a stop that was clearly meant to be quiet and personal, visiting his late mother Princess Diana's grave on an estate belonging to her brother. That part, genuinely deserves some grace. Losing a parent young and still carrying that grief decades later is real, and nobody is mocking that. Where it gets a little more complicated is the reporting that there was interest in capturing that emotional moment on camera as part of a planned documentary project about Diana. And look, I understand the instinct to want to tell that story. But there's a pretty significant difference between quietly visiting your mother's grave and turning that visit into content for a media deal. One of those things is grief. The other is a shooting schedule. Part 4. The podcast that said the quiet part out loud. Oh, and it gets better. During his time in the UK, Harry also sat down for an appearance on a British comedy therapy podcast. One of those shows built around mock therapy sessions with a comedian host. And when asked, on air, for his occupation, Harry reportedly ran through a list. Full-time dad, British Army veteran, Prince, Duke, before eventually landing on just Duke as his job. A 41-year-old man's job title is a title. It's not a job. A job is something you clock into, something with a paycheck attached to actual output. Duke is something you're born into, and now, apparently, something you fall back on when a comedian asks what you do for a living. Look, full-time parenting is genuinely hard work, and nobody serious is disputing that. But when you've also got round-the-clock help, and your primary listed occupation is squeezed in between a documentary deal here, a streaming deal there, most of which have quietly fallen apart, it starts to sound less like a demanding career and more like a very expensive extended gap year that's now stretched past half a decade. And that's really the theme of this whole podcast appearance. It wasn't really about jokes. It ended up being an accidental highlight reel of just how little structure is actually left in this man's daily life. Part 5. The marriage chatter. Reports point to a string of collapsed deals, including the streaming and podcast partnerships that were supposed to be the financial engine of the Sussexes' post-royal life. And alongside that, there's been talk, some of it from people who used to be close to Harry, describing the relationship from very early on as difficult. Some commentators have gone as far as suggesting the couple is, in some practical sense, living increasingly separate lives. Now, I want to be careful here, because none of us are actually in that house, and gossip about someone's marriage should always come with a grain of salt roughly the size of Highgrove itself. People's relationships are complicated, and tabloid sourcing isn't exactly known for its accuracy. But when the pattern keeps repeating, collapsed business deals, a lawsuit draining tens of millions of pounds, a job title that isn't a job, and now marriage speculation piling on top, that's not just one bad news cycle. That's a fairly rough stretch, by anyone's standard. Closing. So here's where we land. A family reunion that reportedly needed a built-in leak prevention chaperone. A lawsuit that cost £50 million to lose in spectacular fashion. A grieving visit to a mother's grave that got tangled up with a documentary pitch. A podcast appearance where the big reveal was that Duke isn't actually a job. And a marriage that, according to more and more reports, needs more repair work than the palace itself. If this is what moving forward as a family looks like, I genuinely don't want to see what falling apart looks like. That's it for today's breakdown. If you want more of these no-nonsense takes on the stories everyone's talking about, but nobody is actually explaining properly, stick around, and I'll see you in the next one.